Heather held her badge over the card reader in the lobby. Ding! Chimed the machine, and the turnstile opened, letting her into the elevator bay of the skyscraper. That ding put her in a cold sweat every day, the sound sending her into a Pavlovian anxiety attack. It meant she was mere minutes away from her desk, where cutting put-downs and humiliating slights were waiting for her. She clasped her coffee. All she wanted was to be home with her dog, Tinkerbell. Heather held her breath and braced herself as the elevator doors opened, but the office was silent. There was no one at the front desk. She snuck into the lobby and took the long way to her cubicle, making a giant loop around the back of the office to avoid being seen by anyone, especially Meredith. She arrived safely and wheezed a sigh of relief. More important things to do this morning, little Miss Small Town, growled Meredith behind her. Heather froze. Meredith put her hand on Heather's shoulder and squeezed, digging her fingernails into Heather's shoulder, and spun her around to face her. Heather trembled as Meredith sneered, her face twisted in a weird grimace, relishing her power. I'm sorry, Miss Grant, Heather stammered. Sorry isn't going to cut it in the fast-paced workaday world of New York City, Meredith barked. Countless rounds of plastic surgery had transformed Meredith's once-long nose into a small, pointy triangle in the middle of her face. She had no wrinkles where wrinkles should have been. Rather, her face was chemically smooth and shiny, like ice polished by a Zamboni. Whenever you decide to start working today, little Miss Always Late, I'll need you to... Meredith took a big breath, reeled back her arm, and swiped everything off Heather's desk. Pens, notebooks, old coffee cups, and files crashed to the floor. Clean up your mess, Meredith snarled with a grin. She cackled as she walked away, swaying her hips confidently. Heads popped up over the cubicles and stared at Heather, their telephone headsets muffling their ears, long arms of plastic microphone receivers snug against their grinning cheeks. Heather hung her head. This is great, just great, she whispered to herself, a knot choking in the back of her throat. She slid her laptop out of her bag and onto her desk, setting her cold coffee next to it. A hole ripped in her stockings as she bent over to clean up Meredith's wrath. I reserved the Brooklyn Bridge conference room for you, a voice deadly croaked above her. Katie, the intern, emotionlessly looked down at Heather. Neither did she offer help. Her wide eyes were unfocused, as if staring through Heather like she wasn't there. Why? Heather asked. Like maybe for your presentation, Katie groaned. The one in 15 minutes? Heather's face turned white. Should I try and reschedule? Miss Grant won't like that, Katie warned indifferently. No, it's okay, Heather chirped. She brought herself to her feet and flipped open her laptop, knocking her mug of coffee onto the computer's keyboard in the process. Oh my God! Heather yelped. Electric zip, crackle, pop noises burst out of her laptop with tiny flashes of electric shocks, and the keys began to bubble like a fresh, always satisfying glass of Crow-Croa. It smoldered as the screen went black. Heather panicked. Maybe Miss Grant was right, Katie said, detached. Maybe you're not cut out for the dog-eat-dog world of New York City. Her nose slowly bled and her right eye was bloodshot. Heather didn't notice. Heather's hands trembled as she nervously clenched her note cards. 12 men in identical black suits with matching haircuts sat around the conference table, watching Heather with glassy, detached eyes. Meredith sat at the head of the table with a satisfied, sinister grin. And, lastly, if we can narrow our expense margins by, But when she went to flip her cue card, she lost her grip, and the entire stack fell to the floor with a plop. Heather, frozen with embarrassment, stared at the room with wide eyes. The men stared back without a trace of compassion. She flung herself to the ground and grasped at her note cards, desperately trying to reorder them. And tell me, dear, your computer is... where exactly? Meredith condescended after allowing Heather to flail for some time in front of them. Heather continued to scramble on her knees. It's, she stuttered without looking up. Maybe you left it down on the farm? Tell me, do they have electricity where you come from?" Meredith cruelly joked. Heather gave up and let her arms fall, lip quivering. She slowly stood up in front of the room. Meredith's face curled into a contemptuous smile. The room was completely silent, save for Heather's heavy breathing, when suddenly Heather's blood went cold. Had she imagined that? Heather's eyes searched the room. The once impassive businessmen began to smile. One by one, they stood up, mimicking pigs. Their mockery grew frenzied, shouted one businessman, with his hands curled up against his ribcage. He flapped his arms and bobbed his head forward and back like a chicken as he staggered around the room. A man flung himself to the ground and started licking the floor, making guttural oinking noises. Another man untied his shoe and put it in his mouth, clenching it tightly in his teeth, salivating outrageously. He pulled himself onto the table and stood with his hands in the air like an enraptured Christian at a tent revival. He shouted through his teeth, his shoe covered in spit. Meredith sat like a mannequin at the head of the table, a satisfied smile from ear to ear. A man ran towards Heather, flailing his arms, sweating, his face bulging. He screamed. Heather wrapped herself in her coat and stormed down 28th Avenue in South Manhattan. Oink! I'll show her, oink, oink, she grunted to herself. If anyone is a pig, she shouted to herself. It's Meredith! She scoffed with pleasure, encouraged by her words.
Hey!
A raspy voice screamed behind her.
Hey there!
Heather turned around and beheld a rotting, disheveled man in a molting, filthy down jacket. He had one tooth, loose, hanging on for life to his bleeding gums.
Get a load of this!
He screamed, smiling. He lifted his shirt, displaying a grotesque, perverse scene tattooed across his warty belly. The lines were shaky and blurred, clearly needled in by the hand of a Navy ensign during some long-gone war. He salivated disgustingly, accentuating the degenerate scene drawn on his stomach. Heather retched as she ran away. His heavy laughter shrunk in the distance as she turned the corner on Broadway Street and 19th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, slowing her pace to catch her breath as she staggered down the poorly lit street. She pulled her phone from her pocket and clicked it on when, crunch, her heel snapped off her shoe. Ah! She screamed as her ankle twisted. She fell to the ground, knees first, and stopped herself painfully with her hands. Ah! She shouted.
Hey there!
A deep voice called. Heather snarled on the sidewalk, ready for blood. What? She screamed. Heather turned with her fists clenched, then beheld the most attractive man she'd ever seen. Dark, wavy locks of thick hair swooped over a healthy forehead with thick eyebrows set above mahogany brown eyes. A Roman nose sat above perfectly straight teeth. He frowned. Heather desperately explained, bringing herself to her feet. It's just that, she floundered. The man stared at her, confused. It's just that, I'm Heather, she squeaked. The man's perplexed frown slowly turned into a grin, flashing his sparkling white teeth.
I'm Hugh,
he replied confidently. Sorry, I've had a bit of a day, she sighed.
I can see,
Hugh replied. They shared a silence.
Wait, no,
he said to himself, turning away.
I don't want to hear about it. That's enough,
he muttered dramatically. Heather stammered. Hugh turned with a smile, dropping his ruse.
I don't want to hear about it right here. I want you to tell me about it.
He paused, smiling.
Over drinks.
He flashed a toothy grin. Heather pretended to get mad, but couldn't commit to the act. I'd like that, she said warmly. Heather and Hugh held hands and twisted their arms together, slowly drawing each other ever nearer as they walked down 36th Avenue and Houston on the breathtaking Upper East Side of Manhattan. Hugh was telling a charming anecdote about one of his coworkers as Heather replayed the evening over again in her head. She smiled as she thought about the perfectly cooked steak that she slowly enjoyed piece by piece as Hugh seriously told her about his mother's illness. She laughed to herself when she replayed Hugh playing a funny trick on the blushing waitress, pretending to pull a coin from her ear. She sighed when Hugh told her he didn't often date and how he was leaving it up to fate to meet the right person. Heather was lost in her thoughts when a familiar bark shouted at her through a closed window. She snapped out of her reverie and took in her surroundings. Hugh toothily smiled, his aw-shucks eyes sparkling in the streetlights. Heather slowed to a stop. "That's Tinkerbell in the window," she explained. He looked at her, confused. "Oh, Tink is, my dog," Heather clarified.
Huh, that's a cute name,
Hugh said huskily. Heather smiled as they grew quiet. She finally broke the pregnant silence. "Oh, well, she said, searching. "You could, come in and maybe meet Tinkerbell and, she looked at Hugh desperately. He smiled uncomfortably and shrugged his shoulders. "Or we could have some, coffee or something," said Heather, trying to recover from the awkward exchange.
Come up for a coffee, huh?
Hugh asked, flirtily mocking her. "Yeah, coffee," Heather replied, batting her eyelids.
Sorry, I can't tonight,
Hugh explained. Again, they fell silent. "What are you doing tomorrow?" Heather asked.
I have a date, actually.
Hugh replied quickly, sounding quite proud of himself. He snickered as Heather's face dropped. "Oh," replied Heather, deflated.
A date with the prettiest big city girl I've ever met,
he said with a grin, bobbing his eyebrows up and down. He took her in his arms and delivered a sweet and sensual kiss. Heather kissed back. Their quickening breaths began to sync in rhythm as the kiss intensified. Hugh pulled away slowly.
Good night, Heather,
he whispered to her, his lips millimeters away from hers. Silently, Heather pulled away. He flipped around and headed down the street as Heather went to unlock her door. Had she been looking, she would have seen Hugh throw his fist in the air with glee. Screamed the buzzer, shocking Heather awake. Tinkerbell shot up and sprinted to the door. "Shh, Tink, I'll take you out in a sec," Heather said lamely, slowly waking up. The bell continued to ring. I'm coming, Heather pled to no one. Finally, she reached the door and gently opened it, hiding her worn nightshirt.
Miss Heather!
A squat man asked with wide eyes, hidden beneath a lavish bouquet of flowers. "That's me," Heather whispered, nearly speechless.
Sign here.
He replied gruffly, and held out a clipboard through the flowers. Heather shakily signed her name. The delivery man shoved the bouquet into her arms, and the door shut as she spiraled in her apartment, hugging and sniffing the flowers in ecstasy. They were radiantly purple, saintly white, and voluptuously red. Her hands caught a small folded piece of paper tied to the flowers on a gold string. She opened it. Excited for what comes next, it said in manly, scrambled uppercase letters. Signed, Hugh. Heather smiled and slunk onto the ground with her back against the wall. The city disappeared, work disappeared, Meredith disappeared. All that existed was this moment, the flowers and Hugh. Heather sat cross-legged on the floor and set the flowers down to get a good look when there was a pounding at the door.
Miss, you have my clipboard.
The delivery man shouted from the hallway. Heather looked around but saw no clipboard. She lifted the flowers to see if it was hidden as a spider crawled down the vase and onto her ring finger. Shocked, she jerked her hands, spooking the spider, and it bit into her flesh. "Ah!" she screamed, throwing the flowers into the air. The vase shattered on the floor, spilling water and shooting shards of glass across the hardwood. Heather screamed as the man continued to pound on the door.
Listen, hey, miss, is there a problem, miss?
The man shouted. Heather sucked on her finger and staggered toward the door. "I don't have it!" she shouted, furious at her lost flowers, furious at her pulsing spider bite. She grabbed for the doorknob. She swung open the door. "Leave me But the door did not open into the hallway. Before her was a wall of fire, burning hot, searing her eyebrows and eyelashes, the force of the heat throwing her back into the apartment. She coughed on the ground, shielding herself from the heat. The fire was all-consuming and eternal, going far into the distance like a fractal. "Ah!" she screamed as the door slammed itself shut. Heather crawled away from the door, cutting her hands on the shards of broken vase. She landed on the hardwood floor on her back and turned her head. The once beautiful bouquet of flowers was rotting, covered entirely in inchworms and black flies. One landed on her cheek and bit greedily, drawing blood with an agonizing pinch. Ah! Ah! She screamed. Flies swarmed her, the buzz deafening. She leapt to her feet and shook them away. Millions of flies landed on the walls and ceilings, giving the appearance that the whole entryway was moving. No! She screamed. She covered her face and staggered down the hall. Tink! Tink! She cried, stumbling into the kitchen. She flailed her arms around her head, shooing away the flies. They left her, as if refusing to enter the kitchen, like something more sinister was lurking there. And in the dead center of the kitchen, in a pool of light, Tinkerbell lay motionlessly. Heather fell to the ground and crawled towards her, scooping her up in her arms. Tink did not feel warm and soft as usual. Rather, something was moving beneath her fur. Her eyes were glossed over and her tongue hung from her mouth. Her ears began to twitch. Tink! Tink! Heather screamed. Tinkerbell's fur suddenly stopped squirming and went cold. From inside her left ear, the antenna of a cockroach peeked out, feeling its surroundings. Then another, then another, then another. Soon, Tinkerbell was swarming with roaches, the bugs crawling up Heather's arms. She screamed, flinging the ball of insects to the ground. Heather reeled backward against the cupboard. She clenched her eyes shut and opened them widely, trying to wake herself from this nightmare, but the madness remained. She wailed until she was out of breath. As she panted, trying to calm herself, she gazed out the kitchen window. There he was levitating, backlit by a sea of fire. He was naked, his red skin blistering in the heat, and his well-endowed penis flapping in the wind. His head reeled back in demonic laughter, smiling maniacally. He opened his mouth and let out a devastating... His body shook. He oinked like a pig. He was terrified. He was death incarnate. He was the end of the world.
And that summer, Heather was truly a New York City girl.